I'll show you the numbers of how many fishes in Illinois, but we have 15, 16 different families of fishes. When I say family, I don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence, but we're talking about that classification system of genus, species, family, order, class. So family is a large group of closely related species. We have several, and even above the family level, we have several different orders of fishes in Illinois. There's so much diversity in life history and reproductive biology we just can't talk about. In a nutshell, fishes occur in any type of aquatic habitat we have: lakes, streams, rivers, impoundments. Reproductive biology spawns, goes through everything. We have fish that simply, males and females swim close together, release their gametes into the water, they combine in the water, they sink to the bottom, and the eggs develop. We have fish that will hide their eggs on the undersurface of rocks. We have fish that will attach their eggs to external fertilization and put them on plants. We have one live-bearing species of fish in Illinois, mosquito fish, where they'll have internal fertilization, and the female will carry the young and give birth to live juveniles. So it covers every type of reproductive strategy, and I think there's a little bit of information on fish ecology, fish reproduction in the handout material, the material you get for the class. Is that correct? Okay. So we just don't have the time to talk about how fish reproduce, what kind of diets. They eat everything. Every type of food you can imagine in aquatic habitat. They occur in every type of aquatic habitat. They reproduce in every possible scenario that you can think of. So we'll just talk about diversity, threats to fish diversity, and try to leave it at that. Okay, so again, like the crayfish talk, just kind of put things in perspective before we talk about Illinois fishes, and that's looking at freshwater fish diversity in the United States, in the lower 48. There are 36 different families of freshwater fishes, and about 800 species of them across the U.S. 10 of these families are what are known as euryhaline marine species. These are species that inhabit saltwater habitats but will frequently invade freshwater rivers for some part of their life history. Now, again, this is the same exact map. The shape of that blob there is a little bit different. But, as I mentioned before, the heart of freshwater diversity for fishes is in the southeastern United States. Again, the same factors contribute to that diversity: spared glacial advances, diversity of different habitat types. It's a wet area, lots of different types of aquatic habitats that have been free from ice for hundreds of thousands or millions of years for speciation processes to play out. The distribution also in terms of west versus east in the continental divide is not anywhere close to being equal. Of those 800 species, only 200 of them occur on the west side of the continental divide. So the bulk of our diversity is eastern U.S., east of the continental divide, and then within that realm, probably we've got of the 800, I would wager to say we have at least 350 to 400 of those 600 species east of the continental divide in that area of the southeastern U.S. However, you'll notice part of that spills up into Illinois here for fishes, which translates to relatively high diversity for the state, and we'll get to that number in a second. But before we focus on Illinois, let's talk about just diversity, and when I say diversity, taxonomic diversity, get to that issue of just more than one family. And these are the largest families of freshwater fishes, and so I just want to introduce some of the taxonomic names and then brings the common names for those groups and how much they contribute to the overall diversity in the U.S. So the first group on this list is the Cyprinidae family. This is the minnow family. There are about 231 different species of minnows. And again, it's like crayfish. People are unaware of the diversity within crayfishes. The same applies for small minnow-like fishes. Most people think you go to, some people think you go to the bait shop, you buy minnows, it's a single species of fish. Nothing could be further from the truth. Okay? There are 231 different minnow species. Generally smaller, with a few exceptions, 2 to 3 inch fish. About 29% of the total fauna is made up by that one family. Then we have the perkid family, which are comprised of darters, and we'll talk about what darters are here in a second, perch and walleye. Some of these names you may recognize, some you may not. I hope to cover some of those that you don't in the upcoming slides. This is another big group of fishes, about 153 species, almost 20% of the U.S. fauna. The Catastomidae is the sucker family, 63. The Ictaluridae is the catfish family, which is a very diverse group of fishes. There are about 40 in the United States. And then finally the Salmonidae, which are the salmon, trout, whitefish. Not a big family here in Illinois, but especially when you move out into the western U.S., in more northern latitudes, the diversity of salmonids is fairly high. About 33 different species of salmon or trout. Okay, it's a broad overview of fish diversity and what groups of fishes account for that diversity in the U.S. Now we're going to stay focused on what's going on in Illinois. And you can't have a conversation about Illinois fishes and what we know about Illinois fishes without talking about a couple individuals in the history of fish research that's gone on at the Illinois Natural History Survey. Our founding father was Stephen A. Forbes. Stephen A. Forbes was a phenomenal ecologist and biologist. He was the first state entomologist. He was one of the first to start to put together ideas of basic ecology, that different organisms in a community interact at certain levels. But one of his main research interests, as he was at the Natural History Survey, was fishes. And as you can see from the text here on the slide, from about 1875 to 1905, Stephen Forbes and his associates spent years and years and years, I almost said driving, going around the state collecting fishes, taking minnow seines, taking traps, getting in our water bodies, collecting these fish, and then saving those fish and putting them into a museum collection as vouchered specimens. Okay? Basically, this map is showing the dots at all the sites he got to during that time period, him or his associates, 475 different sites. Might not seem like that big of an issue, but put the time frame in perspective here. Around the turn of the century, we had very few roads. We were pulling around his equipment with a horse-drawn wagon. That is a real challenge to get to all those areas in that limited time frame. The results of all that field work were published in the book, The Fishes of Illinois, which showed up in 1908. Okay, this is significant because it is really one of the first, if not the first, state faunal books. One book specifically addressed the distribution and ecology of one group of organisms within a state's boundaries. Okay? Significant work. In that publication, The Fishes of Illinois, he had maps with dot distributions showing the distribution of all these species. It's a significant work for that frame of time. The other individual I want to talk about is Phil Smith. Phil Smith started as a herpetologist in the 1940s and 1950s, came on board the Natural History Survey as a herpetologist. He published Reptiles and Amphibians of Illinois, but then moved over to studying fishes. And he decided to go back and redo Forbes and Richardson, Forbes' fish collection work, but also expand it and collect fishes at many more additional sites. And so between 1962 and 78, he basically did the same thing, only he had the benefit of motor vehicles and other collection techniques that weren't available to Forbes. He collected fish at 2,000 different sites. If you look at that map, it's pretty much covered with dots. Those were all collection sites that were collected during that time period. Smith published the second Fishes of Illinois in 1979 that updated distributions, ecology, life history parameters, what we knew about Illinois fishes. Put all that in one book. What this did was, for Illinois, Illinois has a very unique position among the states in that we have historical data that goes back over 100 years on fish distribution and life history attributes. And so we've had two statewide surveys of fishes done. So we are very well positioned to talk about what's happened to our fish fauna, what kind of changes we've seen in 120 years or 110 years. So the preceding information I'm going to give you is pretty well grounded in past research and current research that's going on at the survey. We're continuing to go out and sample screens and rivers for fish communities, so we have a huge database of information for what's going on in our fish fauna. Okay, so here are the numbers. Let's talk about Illinois fish diversity. And as I said before, that red blotch covered up with parts of Illinois. We at one point said about 214 total species of fish. That's a pretty diverse accumulation on one taxonomic group of fishes. We've lost 10 through extinction. We're down to about 204. This is native fishes. Okay, we'll talk about those extinctions here coming up. Again, to put that in comparison, like I did for the crayfish, use the same two states to give you an idea of how that diversity drops out as you move out north and west, and how it picks up as you move down to the southeast. Montana has 51 native species. Alabama has 287. Okay, so we're pretty well positioned for fishing in terms of diversity. Those largest families I talked about for the U.S., this is now just for Illinois, and we see the same characters with one exception. We see the minnow family. We have 64 different minnow species in Illinois. We have 30 different species of darters, and then we have perch and walleye, 19 sucker species, 13 species of catfishes. But what's changed is rather than the salmonids, it's been replaced by the family Centrarchidae, which makes up the bass and sunfish family. And we've got 16 species of bass or sunfish. Good. So combined, these 5 families make up, what are we at? 45, 5, 62, 68, 69% of the total fish fauna is made up by just these 5 families. So I'm going to show you some slides of representatives from each of these families, and then talk about some of those other, I'll say oddball, but some of those other fishes that fall outside these 5 to give you a feel for fish diversity. Okay, first the minnow family. This is a typo. It should be 64. It says 84 here. This should be a 6. Just some general slides of what are minnows. Most people recognize minnows or shiners as small, silvery fish that you get at the bait shop. That is true. There are definitely lots of minnows that look like that, fit that body shape, that body coloration, but then there are also lots of other fish that don't. There's some very, very colorful minnows that we have natively in Illinois. Goldfish belong to the minnow family. They're cyprinids. The common carp is actually a minnow, belongs to that family. This is the one example that breaks that, not a rule, but breaks that trend of minnows being generally small in size. Everyone knows the massive size that the common carp can get. These are some real dark images. They may show up a little bit better in your handout, but just some different types of minnows that we see. This is known as a central stone roller, and you can see these bold spines on his head. They're called breeding tubercles. The males will get breeding tubercles during the breeding season to attract a mate. Also a very colorful fish. They have lots of bright orange and yellows and black coloration in their fins. Very, very pretty fish. This is a blunt-nosed minnow here that's spawning on the underside of the rock, and it's to kind of give you an idea for how some fish reproduce in Illinois. Blunt-nosed minnow is probably our most common minnow. The male will have a nest set up on the underside of a flat rock. The female will come in, they'll invert themselves. The female will lay the eggs that are adhesive to the underside of the rock, and the male will stay in and guard that nest, which this individual is doing here. The perkid family, which is made up of 30 species in Illinois. Has anyone heard the name darters before? Okay. Gorgeous fish. Most of them are in the 2 to 3 inch size range. There are a few exceptions to that. Might get 4, 4.5 inches. These are fabulous fish. Some of the most pretty, these things will rival tropical fish in terms of coloration. Most of that color is in the males. The belief is that it's kind of a mate choice phenomenon going on where females may be attracted to a more boldly colored male. He will have bright colors in his fins and will flare those fins in front of the female and may be used for mate attraction or female choice. Another example of a darter. The group also includes then walleye and sauger, which are large sport fish that can reach at least 2 feet in length. Those are the few exceptions to that small size in the pervert family. For every family that are small, there's always 1 or 2 exceptions. There's exceptions to everything in biology, so that's why we don't have rules like physics or chemistry. So the smaller size in this group is broken up here by walleye, which reach extreme size. I have a little information on the slides on where you typically find cyprinids. Basically, cyprinids, minnows are in any type of aquatic habitat. Small creeks, large rivers, reservoirs. Wherever there's water, you're going to find minnows. And as you see when we go out back after the talk, most of the fish you encounter in a stream are going to be minnows. At least 50% of the species we're going to collect are going to be representatives from the minnow family. We're going to pull the minnow seine through a pool. We'll probably pull up 4 or 5 different minnow species in one seine. Okay. So they dominate our stream faunas, but then are also in any other type of aquatic habitat. Darters, on the other hand, are typically found in riffle areas and more shallow streams. The walleye and sauger are found in pools and lakes, deeper bodies of water, reservoirs. As you can see from the pictures here, the 2 darters, they're normally found under clean rocky substrates. The sucker family, just a few photos of examples of the suckers. They are found in all types of aquatic habitats, from small headwater streams to large rivers, reservoirs, lakes. Within the sucker family, your common name is called red horse. There's about half the sucker species are called red horse. We have a silver red horse, we have a golden red horse, we have a black red horse. Different red horse species. Red horse normally look like this. We have carp suckers. We have a species called the northern hog sucker. Obviously, when you see the name suckers, it's associated with their feeding strategy, what kind of mouth they have. These are species that occur. You find them feeding on benthic substrates, so they just move along the bottom, suck up organic ooze with that mouth that's directed towards the bottom of their head, and feeding on that material off the bottom. In terms of biomass in a stream or lake, suckers generally make up the most biomass. If we were in a slightly larger stream where we could use some electroshocking with some deeper pools, we'd find that well over 50 or 60% of the total biomass of fish is made up by the sucker family. So in terms of biomass, suckers generally dominate aquatic habitats, natural aquatic habitats, as opposed to diversity, species diversity-wise. The centrarchid family then are the bass, crappie, and sunfish. These are most people that know fish are most familiar with species in this family. Largemouth bass, smallmouth bass, rock bass, white and black crappie. This is a long-eared sunfish, another type that we have in Illinois. Sunfish generally hang out in either lakes or the slower flowing areas of streams and rivers. They're not benthic. Most darters or suckers are benthic. You find them along the bottoms of aquatic habitats. Minnows and centrarchids are more, we call pelagic. You find them more up in the water column as opposed to benthic fishes, which are found along the bottom. Most centrarchids, again, are pelagic midwater species. One of them is a very pretty fish, long-eared sunfish, which are commonly found here in central Illinois and southern Illinois. You know, this isn't some camera development trick. These things are fabulous, iridescently colored orange and blue fishes. Again, would rival anything we find in the tropical pet trade. You can find in our streams and rivers, put an aquarium and have a gorgeous fish. Finally, the catfish family. Most people know what a catfish is. But there's catfishes and there's species that are called mad toms that fall in that group in the Ictoroid family. This is a blue cat, a gentleman holding a blue cat. This is a flathead cat. This is a channel cat. So we have those things that are typically associated with the name catfish. But within this group then are the majority of diversity of these 13, probably 9 or 10 of them are what we call mad toms. You would look at this thing and think it's perhaps a juvenile catfish, because mad toms generally don't get more than 3 or 4 inches in size, but in fact they're their own discrete species that max out in body size at 3 to 4 inches and make up most of the diversity in the ictulurid family. Even though they're found in all aquatic habitat types, lakes versus streams, they are more benthic. Most people know catfishes like to hang out in the muddy bottom. They find crevices in woody debris piles. Mad toms, however, rather than being found in soft bottom substrate streams or lakes, are generally in higher quality gravel bottom, firmer substrate streams. The way you tell the difference between a mad tom and a catfish, mad toms and ictulurids have what's known as an adipose fin, which is a fleshy, basically a fleshy fin that they can't manipulate. In mad toms, that fleshy fin kind of gradually merges with the caudal fin, and it's very long. This image is not going to show up very well here, maybe it does in your handout, but catfishes in bullheads have a very distinct standalone adipose fin, rather than being long and merged with the caudal fin. So if you pick up a small catfish-like fish and you want to know if it's a mad tom or catfish, first thing you do is look at this adipose fin.
Chris, what is a ripple?
A riffle is yes, definitely jump in with questions. Yeah, a riffle is a shallow area of a stream where water flows, where you see water breaking over the surface of rocks or substrates that are underneath. When you think of a flowing stream, you have what's known as a pool or a run, which is you see the water flowing, but you don't see any of the bottom substrate breaking the surface, breaking up that smooth flow on the top. A riffle is a shallow reach of a stream or river. You see that water breaking over the surface of the substrate. And the substrate is generally rock or cobble, larger size rock, or gravel. Yeah, definitely interrupt with questions like that. Sometimes I forget and just start using terms that some people are familiar with. Okay, let's just talk about some of the other types of fishes we have in Illinois that don't fall into those 5 families. We have 4 species of sculpin. These are benthic fishes that look a lot like darters. They have very cryptic coloration, banding patterns, so they blend in perfectly with the bottom substrate. A bowfin. We have 1 bowfin in Illinois. There's only 1 species in the world. Bowfin belong to what's called a monotypic family. There's a whole family dedicated to this 1 species of fish. There's several fish that belong in this group called the Aetherinomorpha. Common names include silverside, top minnows. This is a mosquito fish. This was the one example I mentioned that it's our only live-bearing fish. It has internal fertilization. The females carry the young and give birth to live juvenile individuals. Most of the fish in this group, if you can look at this head shape, doesn't really show up here because it's kind of dark. They have upwardly directed mouths. These are fish that you normally find swimming right at the water-air interface. They generally feed on aquatic insects that drop into the water, so they have a very upwardly directed mouth. They don't have to jump out of the water. They can simply move up underneath the prey item and pull it down with that mouth shape. We have 2 species of sturgeon in Illinois. These are generally occur in large rivers. Very primitive type fish with large bony plates covering their bottom, or covering their sides and top, I'm sorry. We have a paddlefish. Some people see the term spoonbill catfish occasionally. That's referring to the paddlefish. We have 4 different species of gar in Illinois, or 3, we did have 4. We have a species called the pirate perch that we find in low swampy habitats. This fish is unique and it's the only fish that has its anus right under its mouth. Most fish, besides this guy, have an anus towards the rear, so we call this thing butthead. This is a spring cave fish. As you can see, this fish has lost some of the some fins. It has very reduced fin matter. This is a fin position has been reduced, fin size has been reduced. This is a fish that we find in spring heads. I've So we don't have any cave crayfish. We also do not have any cave fish in Illinois, although when you go to bordering states like Missouri or Kentucky or Tennessee, there are obligate cave-dwelling fishes that show that same pattern. They've lost their body pigmentation, they're white, they have small, reduced or absent eyes. We don't have any cave fish in Illinois, but we have something very, very close. This has a body shape that's similar to a cave fish, but you find it where the subterranean water percolates up and out of the ocean. Yes, sir.
Is there such a thing as an alligator gar?
There is. We're going to talk about alligator gar. Yep, absolutely. Okay, so just a rough overview of fish diversity, fish shape diversity, taxonomic diversity. Of course, what fish you find and where in Illinois depends, like any other organism, on having the appropriate habitat. Habitat and geology dictates habitat. Habitat dictates fish communities. This is the same slide again. We're going to talk about the unglaciated driftless region in the northwestern part of the state, in the Shawnee Hills here in blue. And again, these are the same slides I had in the previous talk. Here's what you think of when you think of a riffle. This is where you see that water breaking over a firm rocky substrate. We have that in these two regions in blue in Illinois. Here's a high gradient stream that has very steep, generally forested banks. Hasn't been cleared for agriculture, hence we still have a fair amount of timber left in the Shawnee Hills region of Illinois. And also rolling hills. Some of that has been farmed, but we still have some topography, something we're not used to here in central Illinois. And in those stream types, we find, in addition to minnows being everywhere, there is one unique minnow, the Ozark minnow, that occurs up in the Wisconsin driftless region up here. But it's in these higher gradient riffle streams that have common riffle habitats and higher flow rates and generally lower levels of suspended solids because the land bordering those streams have not been tilled up. We find an abundance of, this is a mad tom, this is a darter. We see most mad tom and darter diversity in higher gradient streams in areas like the Shawnee Hills section or the driftless area. This is the Gulf coastal plain section that I mentioned again, same thing. This is just a map. I mentioned the Mississippi embayment. I mentioned during high water time, during the last glacial retreat, that the Gulf of Mexico extended up through the current river channel, the Mississippi River, and just got into southern Illinois. And it's in that area where we see that abundance of cypress tupelo swamps, low flow areas. I'm not going to call them bogs. Bogs are a different habitat type that we see in northern Illinois. Very low gradient, sluggish, muddy bottom streams in addition to swamps and sloughs. And when you look at the types of fish that you generally find in that habitat in southern Illinois, you find some unique types. Gar and bowfin are definitely more common in that type of habitat. Pirate perch is an example of a species that you find mostly, for the most part, in southern Illinois, although there are a few central Illinois populations. These are the types of fishes that you commonly find in that low flow, softer, muddy bottom habitats, either stream channels with low flow or swamps or sloughs. Then the rest, the till plain section, again, the two different terminuses of glacial advances here in the two shades of red. Most of the streams that we're familiar with around central Illinois look something like this. I can't find one or two slides that summarize or generalize all aquatic habitat types, but generally we have some flow, we have some riffle stretches in Illinois, but for the most part, vegetation or riparian vegetation along the banks of our central Illinois streams have been removed. About 50% of Illinois fishes are wide-ranging and occur through most of that central part of the state. So we have at least half of our fauna is very widespread and found in most rivers and streams of various sizes across this central till plain section. Just some examples of the types of fishes you would find in the central till plain section. Minnows, obviously. We find catfish. We do find darters in some of the cleaner rivers and streams where there's shallow riffle stretches. Some charkids, suckers, you basically find representatives of all those groups in central Illinois streams. Outside of that, Shawnee Hills, driftless, or coastal plain section. Now, we also have a few other unique habitat types in Illinois. Of course, Lake Michigan is a dominant natural lake, one of the few in the U.S. or North America. And within Lake Michigan, there are certain species that are only found there, that are endemic only to that habitat type. Lake trout were native to Lake Michigan. Certain alewife, certain types of shad are only found in Lake Michigan. A couple of sculpin species, 2 of the 4 species are found only in Lake Michigan. There's one species, our lake sturgeon, that does occur in Lake Michigan, but then also occurs in the other habitat type I want to mention here, and that's large rivers, like the Ohio and Mississippi. Okay? So very, very different habitat types, with very large volume of water, very deep in certain stretches and very wide. Within those large river habitats, we do have some species that are much more common in there. Paddlefish are very common in large river habitats. You generally don't find a paddlefish in a middle fork of the Vermilion River or the Sangamon River, generally restricted to large rivers. This lake sturgeon is one that bridges both of those habitat types. Several sucker species are dominant and found only in larger rivers in Illinois. And that's certainly where the biomass, if you were to sample an area of Mississippi or Ohio River, where absolutely probably 70 or 80% of the biomass would be tied up in the sucker family. A few examples. Flathead catfish, for example, are much more common in larger rivers. Blue catfish are almost always found in larger rivers. Okay? Almost always you can find flatheads and blues in some of our smaller rivers, but for the most part they're restricted and much more abundant and common in large river habitats. Just, you know, this is just a map that obviously you know where Lake Michigan is and showing the large rivers. The last habitat type I want to talk about, though, are kettle lakes. So we have, besides Lake Michigan, almost every water body, we don't have naturally occurring lakes. Everything we think of as a lake has been an impounded stream or river to form a reservoir. Okay, so besides Lake Michigan, we do have a few other naturally occurring lakes, and these are what are known as kettle lakes. And you may have covered this in the geology section. They're found, for the most part, only in northeastern Illinois, up in the Lake County area. Kettle lakes are just basically pieces or chunks of ice that break off from a retreating glacier. The sediment fills in around that chunk of ice, as we see here. The ice melts and forms its own lake. Within those kettle lakes, as a unique habitat type in northeastern Illinois, we also have various species of fish that are unique to kettle lakes, and I'll have a few slides of those examples here in a second. So, just to kind of sum it up here, this is on your slide, just the various types of common fish that are found in these habitat types, and percent of the fish fauna that's unique and found only in that habitat type with these numbers here. Okay? Salmon, whitefish, some of the sculpin in Lake Michigan, as I mentioned, big rivers, the types of things that are there, how many of those are only found in those habitat types, so on and so forth. These glacial lakes are the same thing as the kettle lakes. There are at least 2 species of fish that are found only in those kettle lakes. There's just some examples of Lake Michigan endemic. You've already seen those. Here's a lake trout. Here's the spoonhead sculpin, only found in Lake Michigan. This is a banded keelyfish, one that's only found in those glacial kettle lakes in northeastern Illinois. This is a pug-nosed minnow, a type of fish that are only found in those habitat types. So we have some very unique habitat types, and those, of course, unique habitat types have a few very unique fishes that are found nowhere else in the state. Okay, so back to the number here, and this is going to lead into the next thing I want to talk about, and that's invasive species. So when we look at this 214 total fishes, 204 now with extinctions, we have 22 non-native exotic fish species now established in the state. Okay, that's significant because when we think of 10% of our fish fauna are now made up of things that weren't here 100 years ago. And that number keeps growing. In 1979 was the year Phil Smith's Fishes of Illinois was published. There were only 13 exotic species established in the state. Now we're up to 22. Okay, so the influx, the flood, it just keeps on coming. Put that in perspective here. Again, picking on Montana, 10% sounds big, but when you look at what's happened out west, and Montana is a great example of this, 41% of their fish fauna are exotic species that have been introduced. For the most cases, things like largemouth bass or northern pike or channel catfish, things that have been introduced for sport fishing purposes. Okay, so we're not that bad yet. Okay, this is just a graph showing you, I'm going to stick on this introduction issue because we can't talk about freshwater fishes and not talk about exotic species and how many of them we have now anywhere, in Illinois and any other state. These are just some numbers and how this has increased over time. This is the number of species. Marine species are in green. Freshwater species are in blue. This is not just Illinois. This is in the U.S. Excuse me. Yellow are brackish water anemones. 79 up to 1900, 202 fishes that have been introduced into the United States by 1950, 587 by 2000, and since 2000 we're up to 615 exotic fishes that are introduced into our aquatic habitats. It's an incredible number. And why is that bad? Well, what we're kind of seeing in a way is, there's the issue of altering functioning ecosystems with different species, competition with native species, what kind of impacts invasive species have. But from another perspective, what we're basically doing is homogenizing our aquatic fauna. And, people that place a value on aquatic biodiversity and uniqueness of ecosystems, we're very slowly losing that. This is just a graph that shows you percent of current fish fauna composed of introduced species, and you can kind of see here that they've got a huge problem in the western U.S. with the dark. Over 50% of their fauna is now made up of exotic fishes. So completely homogenizing what was at one point a unique fish fauna with all our species from the eastern U.S.
How do these exotic ones get spread out like this? Where do they come from and why?
How about this? Does anything? Great time. Where do alien species come from? So we'll spend a few slides here talking about exactly that question. Obviously, the first one is they're intentionally introduced for food or sport. Okay, this used to be a much bigger issue. Around the late 1800s, around the turn of the 19th century, in the 1900s, the U.S. Fish, at the time it wasn't called the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it was the U.S. Fisheries Service, decided it was a good idea to move common carp around to give another food source people would put in their lakes and rivers. And so they intentionally stocked common carp for aquaculture purposes. We've introduced in Illinois, into the Great Lakes, we've introduced silver salmon, we've introduced king salmon for sport fishing opportunities or for food consumption. Brown trout were moved around. Brown trout are a European species that were brought over and spread across the eastern U.S. for angling purposes and for human consumption. So intentionally introduced for food or sport. Yes?
What do you mean by agricultural purposes?
I meant aquacultural purposes. Put them in a pond and culture common carp. We've seen that for some of the other Asian carps, the big head and silver. People have tried to culture them in ponds for harvest, and that's why I didn't mean to say agriculture, I meant to say aquaculture. Okay, they come from migrating after man-made habitat changes. Examples of that are the alewife that Kevin mentioned in Lake Michigan. Alewife moved in through the upper Great Lakes, and we'll talk about how they did that here in a second. And sea lamprey moved through the Great Lakes after a huge change to the way ecosystems are set up. And so here we have a map of the Great Lakes, obviously. This is a map showing the distribution of the sea lamprey. This is a parasitic fish, and I also didn't mention when I talked about diversity, we have several species of lamprey in Illinois that are native. Lamprey are either parasitic or non-parasitic. The parasitic ones are long, eel-like fishes that in their adult stage will attach to the side of the fish. They do not have jaws, they have teeth on the oral disc, and they suck on and attach to the side of the fish. They rasp a hole through the outside of the fish and basically suck out its internal parts for food. Okay, it's a big issue with sea lamprey, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So how did they get here? An example of man-made habitat changes. Obviously, we needed to get commercial ship traffic up through the Great Lakes, and Niagara Falls right here created a huge impediment to ship traffic, and so We dug the Welland Canal around the Niagara Falls. It will allow ship traffic to move through the St. Lawrence Seaway and all the way up into Lake Superior. It's been built over several stages, but 1932 was one of the major changes to the Welland Canal. And what we see here with these dates are the dates that sea lamprey first appeared in those lakes as you move upstream. And so sea lamprey were first reported from Lake Ontario in 1890, I'm sorry. There is a little data that says they may have been native to that lake because they could move in and out from the St. Lawrence Seaway. After we put in the Welland Canal, after between the 1929 and 1932 alterations, they showed up in Lake Erie in 1921, they showed up in Lake Huron, Lake Michigan in 1936, finally showed up in Lake Superior in 1946. So they spread through from one alteration, and that's the canal around the Niagara Falls. Sea lamprey also provide a perfect example of what kind of impact invasive fishes can have on other ecosystem members. I have a slide up of lake trout. Lake trout was a highly valued resource in the upper Great Lakes for many, many years. There were large lake trout fisheries for that species. It was very highly, it had a high commercial value. People liked to consume lake trout. What we see in this image here are percentage of historic average abundance of lake trout in blue. And this is in Michigan. Lamprey first entered the lake, this is Lake Michigan, I believe, first entered the lake 1939, late 1930s. The first record of the first quantitative effort to go out and assess lamprey populations didn't happen until the late 1950s. So at this time, when they started monitoring, they were already very well established and had very high population sizes. But what you can see here, obviously, is an inverse relationship between once sea lamprey moved in and became established and what happened to the lake trout fishery. The reason is sea lamprey love to consume lake trout. They love to attach to the side of lake trout, suck onto it, bore a hole in it, suck out its internal organs and body fluid, and then obviously you have a hole in your side, you're not going to do too well in aquatic habitat. The lake trout end up dying. But high numbers, a drop off. And this really got the attention of resource agencies on how to handle this issue. And so you see a precipitous drop off in sea lamprey populations. And the reason for that is this federal government and lots of state agencies got together and said, wait a minute, we've got a huge problem. Our lake trout populations have crashed. We've got to find ways to control sea lamprey. And what they did was, through spending an awful lot of money, develop several different strategies to knock back sea lamprey populations. Lamprey adults they occur in lakes, but they need to migrate up into smaller streams to spawn. And so many of the streams that fed into the Great Lakes, they put types of lamprey traps or barriers to prevent lamprey from moving upstream. They developed a specific lampricide, a chemical that was specific to lamprey that they dropped into the water to kill off those lamprey. This is a picture of a lampricide dispensing structure that they put in some of these streams that feed into the Great Lakes, and this is just a box, and it's basically a huge syringe up here that over time slowly pushed that lampricide chemical into the water and knocked back lamprey populations. They also tried releasing sterile males, and when you look at the figure, it did have a huge impact. They were successful. This is the time we talked about earlier, getting rid of aquatic native species. They were able to knock the populations back, and they continue to use these strategies to keep it in check, but they have not completely eliminated sea lamprey, and they never will. They stop putting the lampricide in, they take the traps out, chances are the sea lamprey populations will bump right back up. But what you also now see, when sea lamprey were obviously under control, lake trout populations have recovered. Okay, so migrated habitat changes, great example of the sea lamprey, what kind of impact. They migrate after being introduced into other regions of the U.S. These big-headed silver carp you hear about flying through the air, hitting people in the head on boats, that's the real deal. This isn't made up, it's no gimmick that somebody videotaped in one or two areas of the Illinois River. They are literally in almost all reaches of the Illinois River, and both Kevin and I have been out on the river. I never thought I would be afraid of a fish, but when you're going down in a boat at a fair rate of speed, these large things do jump out of the water at you. You've been hit, haven't you?
Couple times.
He's been clocked. It's scary when you see a 10, 15-pound fish launching out of the water and you're moving in the boat. You hear stories of people having their nose broke. Can definitely happen.
Are they in like Michigan yet?
Well, that's a great question. So, yes and no. There's no actual physical specimen that's been collected in Lake Michigan yet, but there's one researcher at the University of Notre Dame that claims to have been able to take a water sample and detect the DNA from these things. And you probably, I don't know, you may have read about all the effort they're putting into putting those electric barriers across the ship canal, the I&M canal, to keep them from moving into the Great Lakes. But again, so far no one's found an actual specimen. If the DNA information is correct, they're there, but there's some, not everyone's on board for that theory yet. It's probably only a matter of time, though. They'll find a way to slip through. They're unintentionally introduced. Kevin talked about zebra mussels coming over in ballast water in ships. There's a huge shipping traffic between Western Asia and the Great Lakes. They take out ballast water in the ballast tanks. You're going to pull up any native species that occur in areas of Western Europe and transport them over. And it used to be, you'd come into the Great Lakes, you'd release your ballast water to make you lighter and bring your ship up, and anything that was in that ballast water would get spilled out in the Great Lakes. You cannot do that anymore. I've got pretty strong rules now that you basically have to dump your ballast water outside before you start coming up the St. Lawrence Seaway. But half these things it's already too late. For invasive species, it's always, once you realize it's a problem, it's already too late. And then of course we have the bait pet trade vector. People have tropical fish in their aquaria. They're moving, they don't want to deal with it anymore. What do? You go out and you drop in a pond or a stream to, free willy. And we've got, especially in states like Florida, lots of these species, tropical species have become established through the release of unwanted pets or unwanted bait. Okay, just a summary here, why they're bad. Some of these things we've already talked about. Some of the questions we've asked from Kevin and I have talked about. They compete for resources. They throw ecosystems out of balance. Obviously, that sea lamprey example is a perfect example of what can happen when you throw somebody else in the mix. And then, they ruin this aesthetic nature of remaining natural areas. This is something that I talked about in the crayfish lecture. You've got a balance of lots of native species, lots of, again, that Antiques Roadshow example where you have parts that work naturally together, increases the value. Same thing applies here for exotic species. Okay, so now I'd like to finish up by just talking about specific examples. First talking about how many species are listed are in need of protection in Illinois fishes. Give you some examples of how those populations have declined, and then summarize once again, the factors that impact fishes. And so, in Illinois, of those 204 native species that are now left, we only have one that's listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. That's the pallid sturgeon, the species you see here. This is a species that's found only in the Mississippi River along our western border. At the state level, there are 18 species that are listed as endangered under the Illinois Endangered Species Act, and there are 13 species that are listed as threat. So well over 10% of our fish fauna is in need of some type of conservation protection. Just a few examples of extinctions and then population decline, specific examples here. So we've had 10 extinctions in Illinois fishing. Yes?
When you say extinctions, do you mean like permanent worldwide extinctions or local extirpations?
Extinct in Illinois.
Okay.
Yeah, and here's a perfect example. This is the bluehead shiner, a species that was only found natively in one spot in Illinois. This is a species that's much more common as you move farther south through the lowland areas of the Mississippi embayment, western Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana. In Illinois, it was part of our fish fauna and was known from one state, this open little red circle down here in Union County, Illinois. It occurred in a single pond. That pond happened to be right along some railroad tracks. The tracks fed into a chemical plant that is still, as far as I know, is still in operation. And I mean, you know where this story's going. One day they had a train derailment carrying chemicals into the tank, into the plant. Tanks spilled into the pond. No more bluehead shiners. There's been several efforts to relocate them. There was an effort about 20 years ago to reintroduce them into the lake. I'm not sure if they've been able to tell if they've successfully recolonized after the chemical spill, but this was a fish that's gone extinct in Illinois because of one, having a small native range, and then one catastrophic event happening within its range, which is unfortunate. This is a fabulous fish. I don't know if you can see just a beautiful, bright, blue iridescent snout on this fish. Just a fabulous, fabulous fish. Alligator gar. Someone asked about alligator gar. It's one I said before, we had 4 species, and I said, well, probably 3 now. This is one of the 4 that we had natively in Illinois, and it is extinct as far as we can tell. This is a species that was known in the backwater areas along the Mississippi River in southern Illinois. There are a few little open red circles here, here, down here. So it was known from several locations, and since we basically made the Mississippi River into a series of locks and dams, and we levied off those backwater areas from the river. That was the backwater habitats, like I showed in the previous slide, cypress swamps, floodplain forests that gar love are no longer connected to the river, and so we've lost alligator gar from Illinois. This is just an example of how big that fish gets. This was a huge, huge animal. I don't know, this guy could be 3 foot 4 though. It's actually not that big, but I mean, there are pictures of this guy exceeding 7 or 8 feet in length. It's a very large fish. Okay, so in addition to having complete extinctions from Illinois, we also have many examples that have experienced massive range reductions, and most of those fishes on the Illinois endangered species list, the 18 and 13 on the threatened or endangered list, for the most part are listed because they've experienced range reductions. And this is where that data from Forbes' Fishes of Illinois and Phil Smith's second version of Fishes of Illinois come into play. We know historically that lots of fishes had much wider ranges in Illinois, and now when we go out and look for them or sample for them, we know that they're only in a very small portion of that historic range. This is one example of black-nosed shiner in the Cyprinidae family. And I realize this is going to be hard to see, but the types of symbols on these range maps are open circles and solid circles. And what this map is showing are open circles here, a lot of open circles here, and just 1 or 2 solid black circles up here. So a fish that was known from 3 different regions of the state is now present in only one of those regions in a very, very narrow percentage of that portion of its range. Okay, so those examples then dovetail nicely into what kind of factors impact fishing, because the things I'm going to talk about now, as I mentioned before, but then also we can directly relate to those species that I just mentioned. Okay, what are the big threats to fishes? Same for mussels. Same for mussels, not so much for crayfish, but that's impoundments. So we've taken all the large free-flowing rivers, at least the large navigable ones, and made a series of locks and dams that's created very slow-flowing pools or very large reservoirs up behind it. And impoundments have 2 different effects on fishes. We have several migratory fish species that would move up and down those large rivers for reproductive activities. The American eel is a perfect example. Okay, this is a species that spends its adult life in large rivers and then migrates out to the ocean to reproduce. Okay, you put a bunch of impoundments along the Mississippi River and it can no longer make that migration out to the ocean for reproduction. So American eels are still present in Illinois, but much, much smaller numbers. I've been collecting fish in Illinois for 20-some years. I've never seen an American eel yet. It'll be a great day when I finally do. Okay. So in addition to blocking migration, they obviously drastically alter habitat type, what habitat looks like. Here's a larger river and a riffle in a larger river. Okay? You put dams across, you take a free-flowing stretch, and you create a deep impounded section behind it. Species that have been impacted by impoundments in our larger rivers have been things like pallid sturgeon. That's why they're federally listed. Sturgeon reproduce over shallow riffle areas in larger rivers. They mate over that gravel, their fertilized eggs fall down into that rock and gravel and find the spaces between and as they develop. You take away this type of habitat completely by putting a dam across and remove that critical habitat for spawning, you make a huge dent in their population size. So this is the type of activity and examples of what goes on from impoundments. Again, same thing, stream channelization, substrate removal. This is the same slide I had. You take a river that had, or a stream that had some structure to it, some riparian vegetation along the edges, some rocks, some woody debris, you make it a uniform channel. You remove that type of substrate to increase flow rates, and you completely remove the required habitat for things like sculpins, mad toms, and darters, those benthic fishes that live amongst that rocky, cobbly substrate on the bottom. They feed on insects that occur on the surface of rocks. You take that stuff out, you increase the flow rate, and you eliminate critical habitat for these species. And another thing it also does is creates thermal pollution. Now, most people don't think of that, but when you remove all the vegetation along the sides, you drastically increase the temperature of that water, especially during the summer months. Higher temperature can lead to lower DO levels, and can also, I mean, fishes have evolved, most fishes have evolved a window of preferred habitat, and temperature profile is definitely part of that.
Would you explain again, how does that work?
Well, normally, if this was a normal stream that we would have found, in most parts, there'd be trees growing up here,
Oh, I see.
creating shade
Oh,
for the
okay.
water. So you remove all that vegetation, and the sun just bears down on that stretch of that stream, and it'll increase the temperature by up to 4 or 5 degrees easily during the summer months.
Thank you.
Drainage of wetlands has been an issue in Illinois. In fishes, you take what was a naturally occurring swamp or bog or slough and transform it to row crops. This is the spotted sunfish. This doesn't show up. It show up on your handouts, the name. This is the spotted sunfish, a species that occurred in this type of backwater habitats in the southern part of Illinois and the central part of Illinois. And again, there's a bunch of open circles on this map. You'll note since that habitat's been changed or drained, this sunfish has dropped out from all but basically 1 or 2 locations here in central Illinois. Okay, it was found down here, parts of southeastern Illinois, and through the central Illinois river drainage. Drastically reduced range because of habitat alteration. Point, non-point source pollution, obviously chemical pollution into water bodies has had it did have a huge impact on aquatic taxa. So that's been changed for the most part. I mean, we've really increased our standard for wastewater discharge in municipalities around the state. 50 years ago, point source pollution was a much bigger issue than it is now. Non-point source pollution, of course, is siltation is the main source of non-point source pollution. Things like the big eye shiner, another example of a fish that's near extinct in Illinois and only occurs in a few locations. This was a fish that occurred in streams across central Illinois. It's a visual predator. You can see a very large eye on it. It picked off insects and fed visually, and that worked great when streams were clear. But now we have all that non-point source suspended solids in our streams. This fish can't see its prey items in most locations. Populations have severely declined. And then, of course, the introduction of non-native species. We talked about the lake trout example, what kind of impact it can have. So we won't revisit that issue here. Now, I'm going to end with like Kevin did. So it's kind of all doom and gloom here, talking about we've lost all these fish species and habitats have been drastically altered. Things have changed, though, and Kevin brought this up. There are lots of organizations that are now paying attention to non-game species. So I just want to mention a few of the things that are going on to improve habitat quality, and that has translated into recovery of several fishes in Illinois. We're starting to see some of those things that we thought were extirpated across central Illinois have started to come back in a few locations through activities such as this. So. State set-aside programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, excuse me, Conservation easement and tax incentives. We pay landowners to take their land out of production, give them a tax credit, to stop farming along the stream, to grow native vegetation. That's had a big impact on reducing suspended solid, non-point source pollution in Illinois. We have seen lots of success stories here. I just mentioned increased wastewater discharge standards. That's had a huge impact. 50, 60, 70 years ago, most towns in Illinois at times were able to dump completely untreated sewage directly into our streams and rivers. Most people know the story, maybe not, about the connection, the I&M connection to the Illinois River from Chicago. So Chicago was going to have the World's Fair around 1900, 1905, or whatever, and up until that point they dumped all their sewage out into Lake Michigan. Well, Chicago was starting to get a fair number of residents, and so they were starting to notice a slight odor problem. They had the World's Fair coming into town, so what did they do? They basically, the Chicago River at one point drained out into Lake Michigan. It came from the north and the south, two branches that flowed through Chicago out into Lake Michigan. In anticipation of the World's Fair and all these people visiting, this is a complete tangent here, but I'll talk about it. In anticipation of the World's Fair and all these guests, they didn't want a cesspool right offshore in Lake Michigan, so they basically connected the Chicago River to parts of the Des Plaines River and reversed the flow of the Chicago River. So basically they flushed the toilet. And so all that wastewater sewage discharge from Chicago, instead of going out in Lake Michigan, now started flowing down through the Des Plaines River into the Illinois River and on down. Classic example of the types of things that have changed over the years as we increased wastewater discharge standards. And then there's also been definitely an increased awareness in non-game species, especially fish. Illinois Endangered Species Act, when that came online, the Federal Endangered Species Act of 1973 had a big impact. The first real test of the Endangered Species Act, the Federal Endangered Species Act, involved a fish, the snail darter, a species found in the Little Tennessee River in eastern Tennessee. As Kevin mentioned, we've got things like Nature Conservancy, Trout Unlimited actually is a fish, Trout Forever, Trout Unlimited, I don't know the name of the trout fishing organization, but fishermen are very aware of the fact that trout feed on aquatic insects, and aquatic insects need clean substrates, very low suspended solids, and so they've made an effort to improve habitat quality. Another thing that's come on in the last few years is the Comprehensive Wildlife Conservation Plan. It started about 5 or 6 years ago. It's basically a tax on offshore oil development. It's a pot of money that comes into the federal government. The federal government sends it to each state depending on area and population, and it's specifically targeted for research and conservation of non-game species. And so that's had a big impact on things like fishes, for mussels certainly, and even a few examples, crayfish. So lots of good things going on that have kind of changed the tide a little bit. Still a long way to go. Specifically, what kind of then physical things are we doing? We're starting to see, in several cases, dam removal in Illinois. Here's an example in the Fox River. Up here, this was around, I forget the name of the town, on the lower Fox River, north of Aurora by a few miles. This is a large piece of construction equipment that's going in and hammering out and busting out these low-head dams that are found throughout Illinois, going from an impounded pool behind that dam to a more free-flowing nature. They've done it in a site up in Brewster Creek in DuPage County, and this isn't going to show up, maybe it does on your slides. This was an impounded part of Brewster Creek showing up here. They've knocked the dam out and kind of reclaimed that natural flow of that stream system. So there's several types of these projects going on in the state. It's a good sign. Here's another example of dam removal. This was with Wansea Creek up here in DuPage County again, where we knocked out a low-head dam and created a free-flowing ripple habitat. There's been filter strips and riparian buffers that have come online. This is somewhat related to CRP programs. We've taken that land right up to the edge of the streams in many places and either planted it with native grasses or left the wooded riparian zone intact to prevent non-point source runoff. And there's also in several cases where we started to go in and stabilize banks that are being eroded using wooden structures, concrete structures, putting large boulders in place to prevent banks from sloughing off. Okay, that's it And abruptly, I guess I forgot it ended right there. Any questions? Okay, so I guess the plan now is we're gonna go, basically the site is straight south of us. You can drive or walk. If you wanna drive, we'll save you probably a 10 to 15 minute walk, maybe 10 minutes. The parking area is straight back. There's a little covered picnic area back there and a parking lot off, a little parking area off to the side. Kevin and I are gonna have a great truck, so if you drive back there, go straight east, go past the lake, go past the camp house, and keep going south in that direction, following the road, you'll see where we're parked. We'll kind of meet there for a second, we'll walk about 50 yards down to the middle course of Vermillion and try to pull around and see what kind of organisms we find.